Hey there, I'm Sean C. Davis, and this is a quick tutorial on building a static API using the Middleman static site generator. This video is to supplement a written tutorial, which also links to some other background information on why you might want to use a static API. So let's dig right in. I've already got the project set up a little bit farther than where the tutorial starts. I've initialized a new Middleman project, and I've dumped our data files here in this data/earworms directory. I know it's a little bit of a weird concept. We're building an API that's going to print out JSON data representing different songs we get stuck in our head. That's all kind of wrapped up in the tutorial and the background articles as well. But let's just go with it. So what I'm going to do is run bundle exec middleman, which will get my Middleman server running. If you're not familiar with Middleman, I'm not really going to cover the basics here. Definitely check out their documentation. It's pretty good. You'll get up and rolling in no time. So if I refresh my browser, then I see I've got the default Middleman homepage. And we see that I've put in my code, I have 3 different data files. They're all named for the dates that those songs get stuck in my head. And each file has 5 different key value pairs. We have ID, date, title, artist, and Spotify URL. And what we want to accomplish is we want to have one route at /earworms.json, which will give us the information for all of this data, and so any other files that we might drop in here as well, and along with some meta information that would just be standard practice for APIs, and I'll get into that. But then we also want to have an individual file for each one of these data objects where we could go to, say, /earworms/3.json, and we would see the data for this particular record. But let's start with that index listing, the /earworms.json, and see how we can put that together with Middleman. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my source directory and create a new file, and I'll call it earworms.json.erb. Now that looks a little bit goofy if you don't have a lot of experience with Middleman. Having 2 different file extensions, it's influenced by the Ruby on Rails framework, and the way it's supposed to work is you read from right to left. And so this file will first get processed as ERB, and then it will get served as JSON. So ultimately it will be available at /earworms/JSON. So to get started, let's just see that we can actually access this, but let's make it valid JSON. So I'm going to create an empty object here, save this file. And now if I come over to my browser, I should be able to go to /earworms.json. And there we go. I have just that empty object, but I was actually able to get to that page. Okay, great. So that part's up and running. Now we want this to put actual data. We want to grab all of these records and we want to output them. But let's start a little bit simpler first. Let's start by just putting out the count, or the number of records that we have. This is what we'll do is we will nest that inside of a meta object, and that the naming isn't necessarily standardized or really matter, but the idea here is that we'll put meta information in one object and the results in another object, which helps make it makes the API a little bit more future-proof, because if we want to change the structure of that response, we know we're putting the results all in a results object, and meta information can live elsewhere. And so it's a little bit easier to be flexible to change that structure later on. Okay, now, even though this file is going to get processed as JSON, in this particular case, we don't actually have to use valid JSON syntax. We can use Ruby because this file is getting processed as ERB. And so let's build this meta object first. We can say we're going to use this Ruby convention here, or the ERB convention, to build a block that will print it on, or that will be printed onto the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say JSON.generate, and then we can put any sort of object in here. So I could start there, and then I could come back over to my browser, refresh, and I have the same result. But now let's start to build this out a little bit. So how about I put meta, and we'll have an empty meta object to start with. Okay, refresh, and there we go. I've got a valid JSON response with all it has is one property, which is a meta. Meta is the key, and the value is this empty object. The other thing I'll note here is that I've got this Chrome extension installed, which is why the formatting looks a little bit prettier. Really, that's the response that you'd see out of the box. Okay, so let's throw the count in here as well. So we're going to say count, and then data.earworms.size. Okay, so that gives us what we would expect, which is the number of earworms that I have over here. So through that, we see that we can get to the earworms data by calling data.earworms, and then size is a typical method on a Ruby array. But let's keep going, because we want more than that. We want to actually see the results. So let's clean this up a little bit, and why don't we say we're going to look for the actual results. And so we should be able to just do data.earworms, right? Let's see what happens. Okay, now this worked. I got everything on the page, but it's a little bit goofy because what I would usually expect in an API response is that results would be an array, not an object. If you look, results it's got this key value pair where the key is the date or the file name over here. That's where that came from. And then the object inside of it was all the information from that file. So we want this to be, I mean, that works. It's not a great design. It would be a little bit easier to work with if we would just print out an array, because we already have that information as the date field in each of these objects. Okay, the reason that happens is because data.earworms is actually it's kind of this custom data hash that Middleman has created. But within that hash, the first object is it's the file name, whereas the second one is the actual values from the file. So we do have these other methods we can run on this object, which it's a little bit goofy, but if I say .keys, now what I'm going to get for results, that's just all the file names. So what I really want are the values. So I can say .values, and I come back over here, and there we go. Now we see this is an array of objects, and it is printing out all of the information. So that's it. I mean, that's kind of what we wanted to accomplish with that /earworms.json file. Okay, but that's just half of what we wanted to do. The other half is let's now create a route for each individual file. We want to get to /earworms/1.json/2/3. Now, theoretically, we could create a new file for every one, right? Like I could come in here and I could create a file at source/earworms/1.json.erb, and that would work, and that's fine. But it kind of defeats the purpose of having this abstracted data object, because then we have to create a new file every time we add new data, whereas it would be nice if we could just dump data in that data directory and have the rest of the site just work, right? Okay, so we can do that through this idea with Middleman called dynamic pages. And we do it by proxying some data to a route and wrap that up in a template. I know it's kind of weird, it's not weird. It's just me saying a lot of words without doing anything. So let's do something. Now we know that data.earworms is going to give us give us all our data objects. I am here in this config.rb file. This file is read right when the server gets booted up for Middleman. And so anything that I put in here, it's all just Ruby code, and it's going to get read when the server boots, and that's the point at which I can build dynamic pages. And at this point, I do have access to that data object. So when I say data.earworms, I'm going to get all the data from this directory in here. So now I can say .each, and this is the part that I was talking about before, where that when you grab that data.earworms object, it's kind of goofy. It's like an array. It's kind of like a hash. Well, when we loop through it here, we can pass it two variables. The first one being the date, which is really, it's the file name, but I'm going to call it date because that's how we're naming these files. And then the second one being the data object, which for now we'll just call worm. So in here, now I can run this proxy method where I can proxy a path, run it through a template, and then send data to that template. So what I'm going to do is I'll call proxy, and then in here, the first argument is the route that we want to generate. So we want earworms / this is going to be the ID. So we'll just put a placeholder here /JSON. The next one, the next argument is the path to the file or the template. So that's that doesn't exist yet, but that's going to be at earworm /template.json. And okay, so let's start there. Now, what we're doing is we're running this proxy method for every earworm as we loop through there. So for the first one, it's going to be, we want it to be earworm /1.json. Well, we're going to get that from the ID value, which is available in this worm object, which is was our value. All right, so we can just simply call worm.id. So let's start here and see what happens. Oh, we look, my server crashed. What'd I do? All right, well, let's go back up. Can we see what happened? Here we go. It said path earworm /2.json proxies to an unknown file earworm /template.json. We knew this. We expected this to happen. That's because our earworms file, or our template file, doesn't exist yet. So this is what we have to do. We're going to create our new folder in here called, we're going to create our new folder in here called earworms. And then in here, we'll create a file called template.json.erb. All right, let's put an empty object in here just to see what happens. Let's try to restart our server and see if it's going to yell at us again. Nope, it seems like it's okay. All right, so now let's try to get to /1, and it worked. Okay, great. Can we get to 2? Yep, and 3. All right, now we've got the same thing for each one of these files, but what we want is we want to render that unique information. Well, we don't really have access to any information right now because we didn't pass any to that template when we proxied the /earworms /id.json route to it. What we have to do is we have to then pass this other object called locals, and in here these are key value pairs where the key is the name of the variable that will be available in the template. So we could just call it, let's call it worm, and we'll pass the worm like so. Alrighty. Now let's load. Still the same thing because what we didn't change was anything in here. All right. But what we can do here is it's really quite simple. We can simply use our json.generate command again. And all we have to write here is worm. And we don't have to do worm.values because what happened up here was we've iterated on data.earworms, and we've split that the file name and the data separately up here, and that's just part of how that enhanced class works with Middleman. So worm in this instance is just the data in the file. So this should give us exactly what we want. Let's go to the browser, and it is perfect. Alrighty, and really the last thing to do here is to say, we want to say ignore true. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell Middleman to ignore that file and not put template.json out in the in the built files as well. So really, that's it. We now have a /earworms file, and we've got a dynamic path for anything that we should drop in there. So let's say, for example, we wanted to add another file in here. We could say, we're going to say 2021. And let me go back here to our listing file. Okay, and notice we now have an empty object. So if we were to add some data in here, give it an ID, come back and refresh, we've got that information. Now we're not sorting these in any way. We're not parsing to make sure they have the right keys or anything like that. I mean, that's a next step. You could really take this to wherever you wanted to go in terms of validating it or cleaning the data up or anything like that. Really, at this point, the world is your oyster. You've got the foundation for being able to build a static API in Middleman. Take a look at the tutorial if you have any questions, if you want to dig in further. I'm always interested to see and learn what you do with these tutorials and where you apply them to the work that you're doing. So hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.